The great thing about QE is, of course, it's not a confidence trick, but it is certainly a trick on confidence. Because, of course, in this country, it works quite nicely because you have, obviously, the Treasury and you have the Bank of England. And so someone is actually going to say, well, let's issue gilts, and so we'll buy those gilts. And so one side of the balance sheet is actually issuing the gilts, the other side of the balance sheet is buying the gilts. Brilliant. How do I get rid of it? Well, because I've got an asset here and a negative there, I can net the two off. So in theory, I could do that, a high portion of that debt already. But if you did so, you'd lose confidence almost immediately. But that's something worth remembering when people talk about the eye-watering amounts of debt that is being built up. You do have the ability to actually manage that down in due course. Not all at once. You let that quietly run off, and that's how you try and manage it. So EU growth will be coming more from quantitative easing. Are you seeing more investment money coming through? In fact, you're seeing a slight slowdown in investment money coming through, particularly from outside the EU, and particularly from the US, unless they're actually going in to buy assets, as of course you're seeing here. Okay, let's spend a bit of time then talking about the UK. In the UK, there are three numbers you must remember. 5, 8, and 14. 5, we're still the 5th largest economy in the world. Some people sit there and say, oh, France is about to overtake us. No, they're not. Actually, India's probably about to overtake us. That's quite likely. But, okay, so we drop down to 6. That's still significant. They're small. 8, we don't make anything anymore, says the BBC every night, seemingly. Well, if we don't make anything more, how come we're the world's 8th largest manufacturer? We still make quite a lot of stuff. Go to the business parks of Britain. You'll find they're mostly full. There are a lot of areas, obviously, which over the past 18 months have suffered, and there are some areas which we're never going to really recover. But one I always like talking about is actually Accrington, or to give its full name, Accrington Stanley, I suppose, or its real full name, Accrington Stanley Nil. And you go to the business park there, you do an interview with a local BBC station who say, I don't know why you've come here, we haven't recovered from the last recession. You go to the business park, and I was there, actually it was about over a year ago, about 18 months ago. It was full, shortage of labour, desperately need more people in there, and actually doing really rather well. And actually not too far away, actually there was an opening up of a new cotton mill. We don't have cotton mills in this country anymore, but we're actually producing the stuff. So don't believe everything you see in the sort of popular news the entire time. And 14, not a very precise figure there. You could argue this between 14, 15, and 16. We don't export, they tell us the whole time. We are the 14th, 15th, or 16th largest exporter, which is, I think, still quite remarkable, given how much it's changed and how useless our banks have been in actually providing any support for all of that. So actually, those, I think, quite comforting figures. Now, where does the growth come from, therefore, for the UK economy? The growth comes from actually the area where you can see actually the investment is already going and where you're seeing most job creation and most companies being set up. Because one of the things that stands us apart from any other European nation is the number of small businesses we're set up. We set up more small companies in this country than Germany and France put together, which is quite astonishing. Now, as a nation, more as a percentage than many of the United States individual states. And I think that's very encouraging. And where are they setting up, or what are they setting up? Well, they're tech companies. In those little tech hubs, you know, those always rather annoying terms of Silicon Roundabout, Silicon Beach, Silicon Glen, Silicon Gorge, apparently that turns out to be Bristol, Silicon Fen, and all of those other ones. So basically what you've got is little tech hubs, and they breed. Once you get 2 or 3 together, they start spinning off bits and pieces. And this is where you see the Americans coming in here, buying up these assets, because this is great intellectual property, but that's the problem. We're losing that. And one of the issues that certainly is high on my agenda is to try and encourage more investment into these development businesses. There are lots of startup funds. We have a London Stock Exchange, really good at dealing with larger companies. Where are the bits for the small and medium-sized businesses? And I don't just mean AIM, almost below that. And these are really exciting opportunities, but of course you get very little exposure to those at the moment unless you're going through some specialist funds, or unless, as I hope we can do, is actually open up markets to some of these smaller ones, albeit they may be rather somewhat illiquid. So this actually stands us apart from what you're seeing in France and Germany. A lot of focus we get here is on things like our car manufacturing. Well, most of our car manufacturing is actually car assembly. But as you can see, the old-fashioned cars are really somewhat outdated. So we move over to electric. But even so, are we ever going to be able to beat the Germans at that sort of thing? Not really. Why should you bother? Go to the bits we're actually rather good at. And we know that technology is an element which has actually been extremely successful for us. One of the problems we're actually going to have to deal with, of course, is the question of what happens with devolution. Does Scotland end up going independent or not? Well, we don't know. And if you actually, it's been rather annoying to me, is unfortunately Boris has not actually been very helpful in Scotland because actually his nature and behaviour tends to cause more annoyance in Scotland rather than anything else. And the effect is it's actually made the Cranky's love child look better than she has been. Her managing the NHS up there has been awful. And the structure and operation of some of the infrastructure investment, again, has been awful. So, realistically, had it not been for Boris, I think she'd find herself in a lot more problems. We don't need Scotland to break away, and Scotland does not need to break away either. They will be considerably poorer in doing so. I do say this north of the border as well, although occasionally I do get bread rolls thrown at me. But the point is this, that actually the UK economy finds itself in a position where it can recover, not necessarily in the enthusiastic ways that we saw in the budget earlier this week, which was, I have to say, it did make Mr. Sunak look a little bit like Gordon Brown, coming up with hundreds of little bits of investment, which all sound perfectly good, another million here or billion there, and mentioning various cities and towns. But that almost gave a sort of fog over actually what was going on. What we were seeing was actually missing out on the really bigger picture. Where was the strategy to really actually see a coordinated infrastructure development? And I don't mean things like HS2, which is a complete waste of time. Connecting more faster trains down to London merely actually means that more investment goes to London. It's across the country you need to operate. Connect actually the conurbations of the north, you'll get far more bang for your buck trying to do that overall. And also then provide those areas the ability to actually start borrowing themselves and having their own markets to be able to get those investments coming in. So the balance there, I think, is actually quite encouraging. The British economy is coming back. You're seeing more investment coming through. We need some more initiative and imagination in terms of actually getting it through in terms of the innovation of further investment pipelines. And of course, one of the problems you've got in places like the North East, who've been so dependent for years on the opiate of EU funding, and of course that's gone, and they're now saying, well, can't we have replacement funding from the central government, which to an extent they have, but that's the wrong way of developing it. There is no shortage of money. It's making sure you have the mechanism of funding it from the individuals, from the pension funds, into regional businesses, and not necessarily having to go via London. Very briefly, let's look at the areas of the emerging markets and how they're developing, and then also in China. China's not going to stop growing anytime soon. The trouble is President Xi has now taken upon himself that actually is going to be much more of a personal operation for his own, and surrounding him and his chums, and has now become a lot more aggressive. You could argue this is repayment time from the 100 years of humiliation dating back to the days of the Opium Wars, where we were actually forcing the Chinese to buy our opium from India. I always find it rather funny when people start complaining about Colombia and Venezuela pushing drugs around the world, when actually we were rather good at selling opium and even went to war with China twice just to ensure they did so. But China now finds itself in the position that it wishes to assert its political authority now, having already asserted its economic authority. But the issue, though, is China actually needs America. As I was saying before, that symbiotic relationship. Because who's the biggest customer for China? And the answer is America. And President Xi cannot afford to have a Chinese economy starting to stutter. Because that way you'll find the party gets unpopular, and the party, remember, does not tolerate any opposition whatsoever. Just look at Hong Kong. But nonetheless, what you've got, that is growing. So after the world's, this huge pandemic's gone through, the financial heart attacks that we saw around the world, we've seen an economy now growing at a level not far off before the pandemic, but you're going to see that drop back off again as it's to go back to longer-term, slower recovery. But nonetheless, I find that quite encouraging. So what should we be doing as investors? One is continue to invest. This is no time to be selling out. Two, you can actually then start looking at those areas which have been very heavily hit indeed and are coming back. Some of that has already gone, the likes of the airlines and things, but there'll be more opportunities. This is a period of financial nervousness, and there will be more erratic behavior. If you think the global economy is not going to fall apart, well, if you do think it's going to fall apart, it's pointless investing anyway. Go and buy a crate of scotch and live in a cave in Scotland. If you don't think it's going to, then you can invest quite reasonably. Don't have to take high risks, whether you're using ETFs, or whether you're using your individual knowledge of individual stocks, and I always like a combination of the two, frankly, be invested and getting the power of compounding of those returns. That's the way you're going to secure longer-term value for you and your family. So, global economy, post all of this, global economy will be growing. It'll be growing with the strength coming out of the United States, with the support they've got. Quantitative easing has been supported in Europe and also over here. That'll be picking up as well. And China will not be stopping it anytime soon. Xi has to keep the thing going. On that basis, now is the time to be invested. But use the volatility to your own benefit. Doesn't always necessarily buying on the dips, but study those areas which you know most about. And when you've got those periods of weakness, use that to your advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, best of luck with your investing, and thank you very much for your time.